The harvest moon hung low over the wheat fields, casting long shadows across Jonas Marlowe's property. He stood at the edge of his land, surveying what remained of his corn crop after months of back-breaking labor. The stalks whispered in the evening breeze, a sound that once brought him comfort, but now only reminded him of the empty house awaiting his return. John, as the locals called him, was a man of few words and fewer connections. At 42, the lines on his face told the story of seasons spent alone, working from sunrise to sunset. 5 years had passed since his wife's death. 5 years of speaking only when necessary at the market or during community meetings. The farm had become his sole companion, demanding and unforgiving but predictable in ways that people were not. Wiping sweat from his brow, he glanced at the darkening sky. Another day finished, another night approaching. The air carried the first hints of autumn's chill, a reminder that winter preparations couldn't wait. There were fences to mend, barns to reinforce, supplies to gather. A farmer's work never truly ended. It merely shifted with the seasons. As John latched the gate and turned toward his modest farmhouse, the settlement's lights twinkled in the distance. Port Haven was the closest thing to civilization on this outer colony world, a trading post that had grown into a proper town over the decades. 4 hours by transport, it connected the scattered farms to whatever passed for governance in this corner of the Earth Alliance. The war had changed everything. 10 years since the Alliance-Earth conflict had officially ended, but the memories remained fresh for many. The outsiders, as locals called them, a term that encompassed any non-human species involved in the conflict, were still viewed with suspicion at best, hostility at worst. John had never been one to voice strong opinions about it. He'd been lucky. His farm was far enough from strategic targets that he'd only heard distant echoes of the fighting. He reached his front door just as twilight deepened into night. The weathered wood felt familiar beneath his calloused palm as he pushed it open, greeting the darkness with a tired sigh. Another meal alone, another night of restless sleep, before beginning the cycle again tomorrow. The knock came as he was stoking the fire for evening tea. At first, John thought he'd imagined it, a branch against the window, perhaps, or the house settling. But then it came again. 3 soft taps, barely audible above the crackling flames. Frowning, he reached for the old shotgun leaning against the wall. Visitors were rare, especially after dark. The nearest neighbor lived miles away, and traveling at night was foolish with the unpredictable wildlife that roamed the plains. "Who's there?" he called, approaching the door cautiously. No answer came. Only another gentle knock, weaker than before. Something in the sound, desperation, perhaps, made John lower his weapon slightly. He unlatched the door and pulled it open just enough to peer through the gap. What he saw made him step back in surprise. A figure stood on his porch, shoulders hunched beneath a tattered cloak. Even in the dim light, John could see she wasn't human. Her skin was an ashen gray, with faint, luminescent blue markings tracing patterns along her neck and what was visible of her face. Large, almond-shaped eyes reflected the firelight from within the house, their irises a deep violet. But what truly caught John's attention were the 2 small forms clutching at her legs. Children, twins by the look of them, with the same gray skin and markings, though theirs pulsed with a fainter glow. Their faces were gaunt, eyes wide with unmistakable hunger. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice carrying an accent John couldn't place. "I'll work. I can work hard." She trembled, either from cold or fear, keeping her eyes downcast. "Just feed my children. Please don't turn us away." John felt the weight of the shotgun in his hands, suddenly aware of how threatening he must appear. He lowered it completely, his mind racing. An outsider, 3 outsiders, on his doorstep. If the townspeople knew. One of the children, a girl, he thought, coughed weakly, the sound small and pitiful in the night air. "What's your name?" John asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Lara," she replied, still not meeting his gaze. "Lara Vesh. These are Ari and Mina." Her hands moved protectively to the children's shoulders. John hesitated only a moment longer. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, "before you freeze out there." Relief flooded her features, though wariness remained in her stance. She ushered the children inside first, then followed, keeping herself between them and John at all times. They stood awkwardly in his modest living space, clearly afraid to touch anything. "Sit," John gestured toward the table. "I'll heat some soup." The children remained frozen until Lara gave them a gentle nudge. They scrambled onto the bench, sitting so close together they might have been one person. John busied himself at the stove, feeling their eyes tracking his every movement. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the bubbling of the vegetable soup he'd made earlier. When he set the bowls before them, the children stared at the steaming liquid as though it might vanish. "It's all right," John said. "Eat." Their hunger overcame caution. Small hands gripped spoons, and they began to eat with quiet intensity, carefully catching every drop. Lara remained standing, her gaze fixed on her children. "You too." John pushed a bowl toward her. She shook her head slightly. "I'll work first." "Eat," John insisted. "Work comes tomorrow." Hesitantly, she sat at the edge of the bench, keeping the children slightly behind her protective stance. She ate methodically, taking small, measured sips, as though counting each one. John noticed how she would pause occasionally, ensuring the children were still eating before continuing herself. "Where are you from?" he asked, settling into his chair across from them. Lara tensed. "Far. A commercial moon in the Rigel sector?" John nodded, not pressing further. The war had displaced millions. Refugees were scattered across hundreds of worlds, some with documentation, many without. "The barn has an old room," he said. "It's clean enough. You can stay there tonight." "Thank you," Lara whispered, the words clearly unfamiliar on her tongue. After they had eaten, John showed them to the small room attached to the barn. It had once housed seasonal workers, before automated harvesters made them unnecessary. The beds were simple but clean, and the walls kept out the worst of the wind. "There's water for washing," he pointed to a barrel collected from the rain system. "Lock the door if you want." Lara nodded, ushering her children inside. John turned to leave but paused at the sound of her voice. "Why?" she asked simply. He considered the question, unsure himself of the answer. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Morning comes early on a farm." John returned to his house, settling into his rocking chair by the dying fire. He hadn't planned on guests, certainly not outsider guests. The sensible thing would be to send them on their way tomorrow, with some food for the journey. Having them here was dangerous, not just for him but for them as well, if Merrick or any of the other townspeople discovered them. He dozed fitfully, waking several times to check the windows. Near dawn, he walked quietly to the barn, half expecting to find it empty, his food stores pillaged. Instead, through the small window, he saw Lara sitting upright on the edge of one bed, her children curled together on another. Her eyes were open, vigilant even in exhaustion. Their gazes met through the glass. Neither spoke, but something passed between them, an acknowledgement. Perhaps. John nodded slightly and returned to his house to prepare for the day ahead. When morning truly came, John was already in the fields when he heard the barn door open. Lara emerged, blinking in the harsh sunlight. The children stayed close behind her, looking marginally better after a night's rest and food. "What work?" Lara asked directly, approaching him with determined steps. John considered. There was plenty to do, but he wasn't sure what tasks would suit her. "The pig pen needs cleaning," he said finally. "And there are leaves to clear from the yard." She nodded once. already moving toward the dilapidated structure that had once housed animals. John had sold the last of his livestock after Martha died. Too much work for one person. But the empty pen remained, filled with years of debris. "Wait," he called after her. "There are tools in the shed." Throughout the morning, John worked his fields while keeping an eye on his unexpected guests. Laura attacked the pig pen with surprising vigor, clearing years of neglect without complaint. The children helped in their way, gathering smaller debris into piles. By midday, the structure was unrecognizable, scrubbed clean enough that it could again serve its purpose. Without being asked, she moved on to the yard, methodically raking leaves and fallen branches. John watched her efficiency with grudging approval. She worked without hesitation or complaint, stopping only to check on her children or to give them sips from the water jug he'd left out. When the sun reached its peak, John approached with a loaf of bread and cheese. "Rest," he said. "Eat something." Laura looked at the cleared space with uncertainty. "Not finished." "It'll wait," John assured her. "You've already done more than I expected." The compliment seemed to confuse her. She accepted the food with a small nod, breaking it into portions, the largest for the children, a moderate piece for John, the smallest for herself. "No," John shook his head. "That's all for you three. I've got more inside." After they ate, John showed Laura how to make flatbread. His mother had taught him as a boy, and he found himself repeating her instructions as Laura watched intently. "Not so hard." He guided her hands. "The dough needs gentle pressure. There, like that." Her first attempts were clumsy, pressing too hard, then too soft. But she learned quickly. By the third try, she produced a nearly perfect round, her face showing the faintest hint of pride. The children sat nearby, playing quietly with some smooth stones they'd found. John noticed the boy, Airy, she'd called him, laughing softly at something his sister had done. The sound seemed to brighten Laura's features, a subtle transformation that made her appear younger, less haunted. That evening, as they sat by the fire after another simple meal, John found himself wondering about their story. Outsiders rarely traveled alone, especially with children. The commercial moons were notorious for their harsh conditions and exploitative labor practices. "How did you end up here?" he asked finally. "This planet is far from any trade routes." Laura stared into the flames for a long moment. The children had fallen asleep on a blanket nearby, their small bodies curled protectively around each other. "I was born on a place called Terrace Minor," she began, her voice soft. "My family, we were poor, many mouths, not enough food." Her fingers traced an invisible pattern on her knee. "When I was 16, my parents sold me to labor contractors." John tried to keep his expression neutral, though anger flared at the thought. Such practices were technically illegal under alliance law, but enforcement was practically non-existent in remote regions. "I worked in kitchens of an industrial complex," she continued. 18 hours each day, sometimes more." Her gaze remained fixed on the fire. 3 years ago, I escaped, lived hidden, caught twice, escaped again." A shudder passed through her. "Third time, I found them." She nodded toward the sleeping children. "Abandoned. No one claimed them. I couldn't leave them." "They're not yours?" John asked, surprised. Laura's eyes finally met his, a fierce light in them. "They are mine now." The simple declaration held such conviction that John didn't question further. Blood meant little compared to the obvious devotion she showed them. "We moved planet to planet," she continued after a moment. "Work where we could find, hide when we couldn't." Her voice dropped lower. "Hard for outsiders since the war. Humans see enemy, not person." John found himself without response. She wasn't wrong. The propaganda during the conflict had been effective, painting all non-human species with the same brush of suspicion and fear. Even now, A decade later, the prejudice ran deep. "Why come to my door?" he asked finally. "There are larger settlements, aid stations in the cities." "Cities have authorities," Lara said simply. "Papers, questions. We have no papers." She glanced at her sleeping children. "Saw your farm from Transport Road, remote. One person. Thought maybe—" She trailed off. "Thought maybe I'd be desperate enough for help to overlook what you are." John finished for her. She didn't deny it, meeting his gaze steadily. "We'll work hard. Earn our keep. When harvest ends, we leave if you want." John considered her offer. An extra pair of hands would be useful with winter preparations. The children were well-behaved, unlikely to cause trouble. And there was something about Lara's determination that spoke to him. A reflection, perhaps, of his own stubborn persistence after Martha's death. "We'll see," he said finally. "For now, get some rest. There's more work tomorrow." Days turned into weeks. Lara proved herself invaluable around the farm, tackling tasks John had neglected for years. The barn roof no longer leaked. The chicken coop, empty for seasons, stood ready for new occupants. The vegetable garden, which had dwindled to just the essentials, expanded under her careful attention. The children grew stronger, their faces filling out as regular meals worked their magic. They began to explore the farm under Lara's watchful eye, collecting interesting stones and feathers, bringing them proudly to show John in the evenings. He found himself looking forward to their small discoveries, to Mina's shy smile, and Aries' serious explanations of their finds. But peace couldn't last forever. Word spread in the way it always does in small communities. A whisper here, a question there. John first noticed it when he visited Port Haven for supplies. Conversation stopped when he entered the general store. Glances followed him down the street. "Heard you've got company out at your place." Merrick, the mill owner, finally said outright. The older man had never been one to dance around a subject. Outsider company. John continued loading supplies into his transport. "News travels fast. Carlson's boy saw them when he was hunting near your south field." Merrick pressed. "Said there was a woman, gray skin, glowing marks, 2 little ones with her." Several other townspeople had stopped to listen, not even pretending disinterest. "What of it?" John asked, straightening to face Merrick directly. "You know what?" The older man's voice hardened. "Those things were with the Orion Coalition. They bombed New Seattle, killed thousands. My sister's family was there." John had heard the stories. Everyone had. New Seattle had been one of the worst civilian casualties of the war. But that had been a military action, not the work of refugees like Lara and her children. "She works for food and shelter," John said evenly. "The children are hungry. Would you have me turn them away to starve?" "There are camps for their kind," someone in the crowd called out. "Relocation centers," another voice added. "Where they belong." John finished securing his supplies. "She's causing no harm. When winter comes, they'll move on." Merrick stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're making a mistake, Marlowe. People here remember the war. They lost family. They won't stand for harboring the enemy." "The war is over," John replied simply, climbing into his transport. "Has been for 10 years. But as he drove back to the farm, John knew Merrick was right about one thing. People wouldn't let it rest. The community had tolerated his isolation after Martha died. But this was different. This would be seen as betrayal. That night, he told Lara about the encounter. She listened silently, her face betraying nothing, though her hands tightened around the mug she held. "We will leave," she said when he finished. "Tomorrow." "No." John surprised himself with the firmness of his response. "Winter's coming. You wouldn't make it to the next settlement before the first storms." "Cannot bring trouble to you," Lara insisted. "You have been kind. We will not repay with danger." John shook his head. "It's talk for now. They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough." But he was wrong. 3 nights later, the sound of breaking glass woke them all. John rushed to the barn to find a rock had been thrown through the small window of Laura's room. The children huddled together on one bed, eyes wide with terror. Laura stood protectively before them, a makeshift weapon clutched in her hands. "Are you hurt?" John asked, surveying the broken glass scattered across the floor. Laura shook her head, though John noticed a thin cut on her arm where a shard had grazed her. "They will come again," she said quietly. "Next time, not just rock." John knew she was right. This had been a warning. Next time would be worse. "We'll move you into the house," he decided. "The back room. It has no windows facing the road." Laura began to protest, but John cut her off. "It's not just for you," he said gruffly. "Harvest is coming. I need you rested for work, not watching for threats all night." The next day brought more troubling signs. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, unusual for this time of year. John studied them with growing concern. "Storm coming," he told Laura, as they worked side by side, reinforcing the storage shed. "A bad one, by the look of it." She followed his gaze to the gathering darkness. "How long?" 2 days, maybe 3. John secured another board into place. "We need to prepare the fields. If the wheat gets flattened now, we lose everything." For the next 2 days, they worked frantically. John showed Laura how to dig drainage channels around the vulnerable wheat fields, how to secure tarps over the newly planted winter vegetables. The children helped as they could, carrying tools and water, their small faces serious with the importance of their tasks. As they worked, John found himself explaining the farm systems, the irrigation network he'd built, the crop rotation he followed, the signs that indicated soil health. Laura absorbed it all, asking questions that revealed a quick intelligence beneath her quiet demeanor. "You understand farming," he observed as they finished the last drainage trench. Laura nodded slightly. "On terrace. I worked fields before kitchens. Was younger then. Smaller." A shadow crossed her face. "Owners thought kitchens safer when I grew older. Too many guards in fields." John felt the familiar anger rising again at the casual mention of her exploitation. Before he could respond, a distant rumble of thunder drew their attention. "It comes faster than you thought," Laura observed, looking at the darkening sky. "We've done what we can," John replied, gathering their tools. "Let's get inside before it hits." They barely made it to the house before the first heavy drops began to fall. By nightfall, the storm had arrived in full force. Wind howled around the farmhouse, rattling windows and finding every gap in the weathered walls. Rain pounded the roof in waves, occasionally so heavy that conversation became impossible. The children huddled together on a pallet near the fire, wide-eyed but silent. Laura sat nearby, humming softly, a tune John didn't recognize but found oddly comforting in the storm's chaos. "Will the fields be safe?" she asked during a momentary lull. John shrugged, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "The drainage should hold for normal rain. This—" He gestured toward the window, where water streamed down in sheets. "This isn't normal." Around midnight, a particularly violent gust shook the house. Something heavy crashed outside, followed by the sound of tearing metal. John was on his feet immediately, reaching for his coat. "The west shed roof," he said grimly. "If that goes, the grain storage is next." "I will help." Laura was already standing, pulling on the oversized work jacket John had given her weeks ago. "No," John shook his head. "Stay with the children. I'll handle it." But Laura was already checking on the twins, whispering instructions. They nodded solemnly, pulling blankets tighter around themselves. "They know to stay," she said, turning back to John. "We go together, faster with 4 hands." There was no time to argue. Outside, the full fury of the storm assaulted them. Rain struck like needles, driven horizontally by the relentless wind. They fought their way to the shed, where part of the metal roofing had torn loose and now flapped violently, threatening to rip away completely. Working together, they managed to secure it temporarily with rope and heavy staples from John's emergency repair kit. As they finished, John noticed water pooling at the base of the hill where his main wheat field lay. "The drainage channels," he shouted over the storm. "They're overflowing." Without waiting for a response, he headed toward the field, Laura close behind. The rain had turned the paths to mud, making each step treacherous. Twice, John nearly fell, saved only by Laura's quick reflexes. The scene at the wheat field confirmed his fears. Water was backing up where debris had blocked the main drainage channel, threatening to flood the entire lower section of the crop. If the roots remained underwater for too long, the entire harvest could be lost. John waded into the muddy water, feeling for the blockage. His fingers found a tangled mass of branches and leaves wedged against the drainage pipe. He pulled, but the debris was too firmly packed. "Need tool." Laura appeared beside him, already handing him a hoe from the nearby tool shed. Together, they worked to clear the blockage, fighting against the constantly flowing new debris. John's hands grew numb with cold, his clothes soaked through. Beside him, Laura worked with equal determination, her luminescent markings glowing brighter with exertion. A sudden gust ripped across the field, sending a piece of corrugated metal flying toward them. John saw it too late, raising his arm in a futile attempt to shield himself. But Laura moved faster, shoving him aside. The metal edge caught her shoulder instead, tearing through the jacket and into flesh. She made no sound, simply gripped the drainage pipe more firmly, and continued working. "You're hurt." John tried to examine her shoulder, but she shook her head. "Not finished," she replied, voice tight with pain. "Field first." It took another hour of grueling work before the drainage system functioned properly again. By then, both were shivering uncontrollably, covered in mud from head to toe. The rain had finally begun to slacken, though the wind continued to howl. As they trudged back toward the house, John noticed Laura stumbling slightly. "Lean on me," he offered, extending his arm. She hesitated only briefly before accepting, her weight settling against his side. They moved slowly through the storm, united in exhaustion and shared purpose. Inside, the children rushed to Laura, their small faces creased with worry. John helped her to a chair, then retrieved his medical kit. The wound on her shoulder was deep but clean. The metal had sliced rather than torn. "This needs stitches," he said, examining it carefully. Laura nodded once. "Do what is needed." As John cleaned and stitched the wound, he found himself impressed by her stoicism. She made no sound beyond controlled breathing, her gaze fixed on some distant point. The children watched solemnly, Mina holding her brother's hand in a white-knuckled grip. "You saved the field," John said as he finished bandaging her shoulder. "And possibly me as well." Laura's violet eyes met his. "You saved us first," she said simply. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that they were no longer merely worker and employer, refugee and reluctant host. The storm had forged a different connection, one built on mutual respect and shared struggle. The next morning dawned clear and surprisingly calm, as though the storm had exhausted itself into tranquility. John rose early, eager to assess the damage in daylight. Laura joined him, despite his insistence that she rest, her injured arm held carefully against her body. The farm had weathered the storm better than many would have. The repaired shed roof had held. Most of the wheat still stood, saved by their midnight efforts with the drainage system. There was debris everywhere, branches, roofing material, even someone's chicken coop door that had blown from a neighboring farm. But the essential structures remained intact. They were surveying the vegetable garden when the sound of approaching vehicles reached them. John tensed, recognizing Merrick's distinctive transport among them. 3 vehicles pulled up to the farm gate, disgorging a group of townspeople. Merrick led them, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Stay behind me," John murmured to Lara, moving to meet the approaching group. "Marlowe," Merrick called as they neared. "We're checking damage after the storm. Everyone helping neighbors today." John nodded cautiously. "Appreciate the thought, but we've managed." Merrick's gaze shifted to Lara, who stood a few paces behind John. His expression hardened. "Still harboring them, I see." Several people in the group muttered, casting hostile glances at Lara. John noticed at least 2 carried tools that could easily serve as weapons. "She's earned her place here," John replied evenly. "Worked harder than any hired hand I've ever had." "Work isn't the issue." Merrick stepped closer. "Loyalty is. Trustworthiness is. Those creatures sided against humanity in the war. They can't be trusted." John felt his patience fraying. "She's a refugee with children, Merrick, not a soldier. And they nearly died last night saving my wheat crop." A woman in the group, Sarah, who ran the community store, spoke up. "What do you mean, saved your crop?" John explained briefly about the blocked drainage and their struggle in the storm. As he spoke, he saw several faces in the group showing reluctant interest, especially when he described how Lara had been injured protecting both him and the field. "Show us," one of the farmers said. "These drainage channels." John led them to the wheat field, explaining what they'd done. The farmers among them nodded with professional appreciation, recognizing the effectiveness of the system and the work it must have taken to clear it during the height of the storm. "Most fields around here got flattened," another farmer admitted grudgingly. "Ernesto lost his entire east section. Peterson's place is underwater still." John glanced at Lara, who had followed at a distance, the children close behind her. "We worked together. Couldn't have done it alone." Merrick seemed less impressed. "One good deed doesn't erase what they are." "And what are they, exactly?" John asked, his voice sharp. "Because all I see is a woman and 2 children who work hard, ask for nothing but food and shelter, and risk their lives to save a crop they won't even benefit from." Oh, uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Finally, Sarah stepped forward, looking directly at Lara for the first time. "Your arm," she said, gesturing to the bandage visible beneath Lara's torn sleeve. "That happened during the storm." Lara nodded silently. Sarah turned to Merrick. "My brother was at New Seattle too, remember? But he also said not all the outsiders fought against us. Some tried to help. Got caught in the middle." She hesitated, then added, "Maybe we've been too quick to judge." The statement hung in the air, challenging years of ingrained suspicion. John watched the group, seeing the conflict play across their faces, the war's bitter memories battling against the evidence before them. Merrick stared at Lara for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to John's surprise, he removed his hat and inclined his head slightly. "I lost people I loved in that war," he said, his voice rough. "Makes it hard to see straight sometimes." He glanced at the carefully preserved wheat field, then back at Lara's bandaged arm. "But I can recognize honest work when I see it. And courage." He extended his hand to John. "Your field looks good, Marlowe. Better than most. If you need anything for repairs, let us know." John accepted the handshake, understanding it for the olive branch it was. As the group prepared to leave, Sarah approached Lara directly. "Those children could use some new clothes," she said matter-of-factly. "I've got some my grandkids outgrew, and extra bandages for that arm." She glanced at John. "I'll bring them by tomorrow, if that's all right." John nodded, too surprised to formulate a proper response. As the vehicles departed, Lara came to stand beside him, her expression wondering. "They changed minds," she said softly. "Why?" John considered the question. "People can hold on to fear and anger for a long time," he said finally. "But sometimes, all it takes is seeing someone differently, seeing their actions instead of their appearance, to begin changing that. The days following the storm brought an unexpected shift in the farm's fortunes. True to her word, Sarah arrived the next day with clothes for the children, bandages for Laura, and freshly baked bread to fatten up those little ones. She was followed by others, Ernesto with extra roofing material, the Petersons with preserved fruit, Dr. Williams to properly examine Laura's shoulder. Each visitor brought something, but more importantly, each acknowledged Laura and the children directly. Some interactions were awkward, others genuinely warm, but all represented a thawing of the hostility that had threatened to drive them away. As autumn deepened, John made a decision. He took Laura to a small section of fallow land on the eastern edge of the property. "This soil's good," he explained, walking the perimeter with her. "Rested for 2 seasons now. Should yield well with proper care." Laura examined the earth, crumbling it between her fingers as John had taught her. "Good drainage, rich color," she agreed. "What will you plant?" "Not me," John replied. "You." She looked up sharply, confusion evident in her violet eyes. "This section," John continued, suddenly feeling uncharacteristically nervous. "It's yours to work. Whatever you grow, you keep or sell as you choose. I'll provide tools and initial seed." Laura's luminescent markings pulsed brighter, betraying her emotion though her face remained carefully controlled. "Why?" she asked, the same simple question she'd posed that first night. John looked out over the land, his life's work, and his family's legacy. "Because you've earned it," he said finally. "Because everyone deserves a chance to build something of their own." The gratitude in her eyes made him look away, uncomfortable with its intensity. "It's just a small plot," he added gruffly. "Nothing special." But they both knew it was more than land he was offering. It was legitimacy, belonging, a first step toward a place in the community. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Laura told the children about their new project. Their excitement filled the normally quiet house with chatter, plans spilling from them about what they might grow, how they would help. John watched their animation with a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the crackling flames. Later, after the children had fallen asleep, Laura sat beside John on the porch, both of them gazing at the star-filled sky. "On my world," she said softly, "there is a belief. When someone gives land, even small piece, they give part of their soul." She turned to look at him. "Most precious gift." John considered this. In human culture, land often means security, future. He paused. Family. The word hung between them, laden with meaning. John hadn't used it aloud in years, not since Martha. Speaking it now felt like unlocking a door long closed. Laura seemed to understand the significance. Her hand moved tentatively across the space between them, coming to rest lightly on his weathered one. "Family," she repeated, the word a question and an affirmation both. John turned his hand to clasp hers, the simple contact cementing something neither was ready to name, but both recognized. As winter approached, Laura and the children moved permanently into the house. The community's acceptance continued to grow, particularly after Laura introduced several farming techniques from her homeworld that improved yield in poor soil sections. The children began attending the small school in Port Haven, transported along with neighboring farm children. The day before the first frost, John took Laura to the county seat. There, in the administrative office, he filed paperwork that would officially register her plot of land in her name. The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly at processing property for an outsider, but after the recent policy changes allowing refugee integration, there were no legal barriers. "Sign here," the clerk instructed, pushing the document toward Laura. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the pen. John watched as she carefully formed the letters of her name, perhaps the first time she'd signed anything as a free woman rather than as property or fugitive. When the clerk handed her the registered copy, Laura held it against her chest, eyes closed briefly in a moment of private emotion. Outside, in the weak winter sunlight, she looked at John with a newfound confidence in her stance. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." John felt suddenly awkward, unused to such direct gratitude. "You earned it," he repeated his earlier assertion. "I just did the paperwork." Laura shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Not just land, for seeing person, not outsider. For teaching children humans can be kind. For—" she hesitated, searching for words. "For making place where we belong." John thought about the empty farmhouse he'd inhabited for 5 years after Martha's death. How it had been a shelter, but not truly a home. Now, with Laura's cooking, filling the kitchen with unfamiliar but delicious aromas, with children's laughter echoing from rooms long silent, it had become something else entirely. "You did the same for me," he admitted quietly. The wheat harvest that year was the best in memory, not just for John's farm, but across the region. At the Harvest Festival, traditionally held in Port Haven's Community Hall, Laura and the children attended as John's guests. There were still some cautious looks, a few people who kept their distance, but they were far outnumbered by those who welcomed the family. Merrick approached during the celebration, a cup of cider in hand. "That farming technique of hers," he said without preamble. "The one with the companion planting. My south field yielded 30% more using it." He took a sip of cider. "Thought you should know." John nodded, understanding the acknowledgement beneath the practical observation. "She's working on something new for erosion control as well. I'll send her your way when she's tested it properly." Merrick glanced across the room, where Laura was showing several farm wives how to braid wheat in the style of her homeworld. "Times change," he said simply, and moved away. Winter passed in a blur of quiet evenings and busy days. John found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining earth customs to Laura, answering the children's endless questions about everything from snow to farm machinery. In turn, he learned about Laura's world, its 3 moons, its musical language, its tradition of storytelling through intricate knotwork. By spring, it seemed the most natural thing in the world for John to ask Laura to stay permanently, not as a worker, but as a partner. Her acceptance came without hesitation, her violet eyes reflecting a certainty that matched his own. They married in the field where they had fought the storm together, with the whole community in attendance. Ari and Mina stood proudly at their sides, no longer the frightened, hungry children who had arrived on a stormy night, but confident, loved members of an unlikely family. As the harvest moon rose once more over the wheat fields, John stood at the edge of his land, their land now, watching Laura work her own plot in the fading light. The twins helped, their small hands capable and sure after months of practice. Their laughter carried on the evening breeze, a sound that had become as familiar to him as the whisper of wheat stalks. Later, sitting together on the porch as the children slept inside, John found himself saying, "I can't imagine what my life would be without you 3. Laura leaned against his shoulder, her warmth a comfort against the autumn chill. She held the deed to her land, now formally filed and officially recognized, tracing its edges with gentle fingers. "We did everything for them and for the future," she said, glancing toward the house where the children slept. "And now, we belong to each other." John nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The simple truth of her words settled into his heart. From strangers, brought together by desperation, they had forged something neither had dared hope for, a family built not on blood, but on choice, on respect, on love grown slowly through shared struggle and triumph. As the stars appeared one by one above the darkening fields, John thought about the frightened woman who had stood on his porch a year ago, offering the only thing she had, her labor, in exchange for her children's survival. How different they both were now. How different the world seemed when viewed not through fear and isolation, but through connection and hope. The wheat fields stretched before them, ready for another season of planting, growing, harvesting. The eternal cycle that had once been John's solitary burden and was now their shared purpose. Whatever came next, they would face it together, a family forged in adversity and strengthened by belonging. "We belong to each other," John repeated softly, the words a promise and a blessing both. In the peaceful dark, Lara's markings glowed with quiet contentment, illuminating their joined hands as they looked toward tomorrow.